Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International Podcast. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm joined today by Eugene L. Meyer, the editor of our quarterly B'nai B'rith magazine and a former Washington Post reporter, 34 years at the Post, and editor. Today, we'll be talking about Gene's new book, 5 for Freedom, The African American Soldiers in John Brown's Army, about the lives and deaths and legacies of these forgotten figures who went with the famed abolitionist in an ill-fated raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, then Virginia,
correct,
in 1859. Gene, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
As a child, I remember hearing about John Brown for the first time, I think, in one of the verses of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and always wondered who was John Brown. And of course, as I got older, came to know a little more about the raid at Harper's Ferry. So there's a lot that's known about John Brown, but certainly a lot less known about those who came with him in that raiding party that day, or in those days leading up to and then the raid itself. So how did you choose this as a subject to write a book about?
Sure. Well, it started in 2000 when I covered a ceremony at a cemetery outside of Washington. It was a dedication of a plaque to one of the 5, Osborne Perry Anderson. And he was a new figure to me, but one of his collateral descendants was there, and I learned about him, and I learned about the other 4 for the first time. And I was fascinated. And it was a brief story. It ran inside the Metro section of the Post. Probably not a lot of people saw it, but it made a big impression on me. So when I left the Post in 2004, I did a long article for the Washington Post magazine about him called Sole Survivor. He was in fact the sole survivor of the raid on Harper's Ferry, and he wrote the only insider account of the raid. And he was very closely allied with a woman named Mariaschin. He had gone to Canada after the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, and she was the first African-American publisher, and female publisher and editor in North America. And he worked for her as a printer. They were both from southeastern Pennsylvania. And he seemed to follow everywhere. And I thought, well, maybe there was more to their relationship. So a few years later, I went to her archives at Howard University. A number of her papers were there. Found nothing to support my speculation. What I did find was some letters that she had published in the Provincial Freeman, her newspaper, that were written by John Copeland, another one of the 5, to his family back in Oberlin, just before he was executed on December 16th, 1859. And they were heart-wrenching letters. And I had an epiphany. I thought, there's a story here, but it has to be about all 5. And thus was born the idea for 5 for Freedom. Now, I had spoken to, in preparation for the magazine article, I had spoken to Stephen Oates, who was a prominent John Brown biographer. And I asked him, I said, why isn't there more about Osborne Perry Anderson specifically? And he said, well, a couple reasons. One was just racism, and he had been dismissively treated by a number of even sympathetic Brown historians. And the other reason was that there's so little known about him. And I took both of those as a challenge. And so, fast forward a few years, and I expanded an earlier book proposal that was just about Anderson to encompass all 5, and who had been overshadowed for nearly 160 years by Brown, such a towering figure, martyred, and the subject of the song that you learned about as a youngster. And thus was born 5 for Freedom, the African American Soldiers in John Brown's Army.
Well, 1859, a couple of years before the Civil War breaks out, but you could say that the raid on Harper's Ferry was kind of a tipping point in terms of where the country was going at that particular time. The objective of the raid was to spark a slave rebellion, at least in large part. How did the 5 that you write about, how did they hear about this? Now, you're living in a time when you can mail a letter and get a letter, I suppose, but it takes a long time. There's no other way to communicate. How did the 5 wind up participating with Brown in this effort?
Well, they came to John Brown by different routes, and Osborne Anderson had been in Chatham, Ontario, when Brown in May 1858 held a convention to approve a provisional constitution for the free black republic he hoped to establish in the Appalachian Mountains. And he, in fact, was the only one from Chatham who went to Harper's Ferry, so he knew Brown from there. Two of the men came from Oberlin, Ohio. One of them, Lewis Leary, had heard Brown speak at a rally in northeastern Ohio, and he recruited his John Copeland, by whom he was related through marriage, and that's how they came to join with Brown. Shields Green was a fugitive slave from Charleston, South Carolina, who had somehow found his way to Rochester, New York, and had become friends with Frederick Douglass. In fact, stayed with him in his home, and there he met Brown and learned a little bit about what Brown had in his mind. And Dangerfield Newby is a very interesting and tragic character because he was a free man of color, and he had established an effective marriage with an enslaved woman named Harriet, and they had as many as 7 children. And she was she was owned by a man and a doctor in Brentwood, Virginia, who was planning to sell her because he was in need of funds and sell her and the children. And so Dangerfield Newby, who had been in Ohio, he was originally from Virginia, but he and his family were in Ohio, not his immediate family, but his parents and siblings. So he joined up with Brown in an effort to liberate his enslaved wife and their children. And in fact, during the spring and summer of 1859, she had written him 3 letters, each one more desperate than the last, saying, "Dangerfield, you are my one bright hope, and please come and come soon before master sells me and the children." And tragically, he was killed on the streets of Harper's Ferry on the second day, October 17th, 1859, and she and the children were sold south, and that's a very sad part of the story.
Douglass, when hearing about this plan, wasn't very encouraging because he felt this would not succeed. What can you tell us about that?
Right. Well, John Brown was hoping to recruit a national figure for his little army, and he sought to enlist Frederick Douglass and arranged to have a meeting with Douglass at an abandoned quarry outside of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in August 1859. Douglass came down with Shields Green, and actually the parley lasted a whole weekend. They talked for hours and hours, and Douglass said, you were walking into a perfect steel trap, and he was convinced, rightly so, that it would not succeed. And so he went back to Rochester at the end of their long meeting. He turned to Shields Green and he said, what do you want to do? And Shields Green famously said, well, not so famously because the story's not that well known, but maybe now more so. He said, I think I'll go with the old man. And in fact, he did. He went to Harper's Ferry with John Brown, first to the Kennedy farmhouse in nearby Maryland, where they all converged and prepared for the raid. And he was captured, and he was tried and convicted and executed along with John Copeland on December 16th, 1859.
The trail of what happened to these 5, I would have thought, over the years, would have kind of just been eclipsed by time. But you were able to track down these stories. There are descendants. What kind of contact did you have with them? And what did they know?
Well, that was interesting because the centennial of the John Brown raid in 1959 was literally a whitewash affair. In the 150 or so pictures I looked at that the Park Service took, there wasn't one person of color. And essentially, the John Brown was treated as a villain. The Civil War reenactors, recaptured him in a mock, what they called a sham battle, and people cheered. They cheered the fact that John Brown was captured. They had no sympathy for the enslaved people he was trying to liberate. Well, fast forward to 2009, the sesquicentennial, and it's a different era. The first African American president of the United States, and the Park Service had also changed quite a bit, and they made a great effort to reach out to descendants on all sides. So I started with a list of descendants from the Park Service at Harper's Ferry, and I was able to reach out to quite a few, from as close as our metropolitan area here in Washington, D.C., to as far as Cannaville, Utah, population 160, where I met and spent some time with Ashton Robinson, a descendant of Dangerfield Newby, who lives 2 miles off the pavement in this very remote outpost, I would say.
The stories passed down through time.
Well, yes and no. I mean, Ashton Robinson, both his parents went to a segregated high school, Dunbar in D.C., a very famous high school. And they were fair-skinned and they passed for white. They moved north. And so Ashton didn't know until he was in his mid-40s that he was African-American, much less that he was descended from Dangerfield Newby. So there were generations and layers upon layers of lies, really. And so he's had quite an emotional journey since he's learned about who he is and what he is and dealing with these existential questions and also with the story of Dangerfield Newby and the tragedy of his life and death.
And what kind of response, I'm just curious, when you contacted the descendants, it was kind of out of the blue, there must have been welcoming, clearly, but tell me about the reaction that you got.
Well, in general, very receptive. There was one descendant of Dangerfield Newby who was both generous and proprietary with her family's information. But she was very kind. She directed me to the area where her ancestors had been enslaved. This was in Fauquier County in Northern Virginia, I guess you'd say, about an hour's drive from Washington. And I talked to descendants of John Copeland, both in Indiana and Chicago and closer to here, and they were very forthcoming and very helpful. And of course, Ashton Robinson was a treasure trove. He very generously shared all the family history that he'd spent 25 years digging up since he had this epiphany and learned who he was and who he was descended from. So in general, they were very cooperative. Now I reached a descendant of Haywood Shepherd. He was a free man of color from Winchester, worked for the railroad, and he was not with Brown. He happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Brown's men ordered him to stop when the night of the raid, and he didn't. And so he was shot in the back, and he died. And ironically, he became a hero for those who were trying to perpetuate the myth of the Old South and the faithful slave. And there was actually a memorial dedicated to him in 1931 at Harper's Ferry by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So I reached one of his descendants in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Very nice gentleman, Gil Shepherd, and he thought that Haywood Shepherd was with John Brown. And I had to sort of, tell him, no, that wasn't really the case. He just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I actually found his grave, which was quite exciting. These are the little surprises that you unearth as you do your research, because people thought he was buried somewhere in Winchester, but nobody knew where. And he's actually interred in Woodlawn Cemetery in southeast Washington, D.C. So that was, as a researcher, that was exciting.
Now, we talked about the centennial of the raid and then the sesquicentennial and how history is being, shall we say, the blind spots are being rectified. What impact do you think your book, your research, will have now on future historians who will be writing? We have the 200th anniversary of the raid. You've really now provided a great deal of information about these 5 African Americans. What impact do you think it'll have?
Well, I hope that the readers, not just historians, will view this really important event in American history through a different lens, and they won't just see John Brown, the martyred abolitionist, but they'll see these 5 men, as well as the others who were white, and some of them were his sons and other folks, as individuals who came to Brown through different paths and different motivations, and not just lump them all together and sort of treat them as even tertiary characters in this drama. I think it's important that these hidden figures get the recognition that has long been withheld from them, and I'm proud to have been part of that.
You talk about hidden figures. You've written about other hidden figures, and New York Times now, for example, is publishing obituaries about many folks who made important contributions to all kinds of disciplines, and kind of making up for lost time. how important is that? I mean, in terms of all of us, reaching back and opening, in effect, these new files on so many important people who just have not appeared in our history in any way.
Well, I think it's very important, and primarily I think the Times is focused on women who made great contributions and were little noted, and that's that's just a reflection of the sexism that permeated society for so many decades, and but there are also stories of extraordinary, ordinary people that need to be told, and I think that's also a challenge and an important thing for writers to take on.
Well, Gene, I think what you've done here in highlighting these stories and bringing it to light, in adding so much more to the story of a very seminal event in our history, in our nation's history, paying the due to these folks who made a sacrifice. We talk about the executions. You mentioned a couple. The outcome wasn't exactly as they had hoped, but to talk about the role that they played in this very important chapter in American history is extremely important. What's next on your agenda? What are you looking at next?
Well, I'm thinking of a few things. I actually had started working on a memoir before this project came together, and I'm also interested in the African American senators and congressmen that were elected to Congress during the Reconstruction period. I'm curious to know whether what their interactions were. We have the Congressional Black Caucus as sort of a political force in our current environment, and I don't know enough yet as to whether anything like that existed at the time. And so that's something I'm looking into. And, I could pick up my memoir and we'll see about that. I think it's important for people to know that there is real news. And, and I lived as a reporter through tumultuous times and did lots of interesting things. The things are probably more interesting than I am, but that's a subject for another day.
Well, will we meet some hidden figures in the maybe in your memoir, but in what you're going to be doing about African American members of Congress in the Reconstruction period? Will there be a lot of people that we haven't heard about before?
Well, possibly. As I say, I'm just beginning the research, and I've been quite busy doing what we're doing now, talking about the five African Americans with John Brown, and also the original sin of slavery, which John Brown said, only by blood would this be purged, and so we had a civil war with 750,000 people died, and I think that we still have a ways to go. So that's the story I'm telling right now and focusing on primarily.
Gene, thank you. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast. Please visit our website, b'nai.org, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter. Subscribe on your smartphone through the podcast app for iPhone or through Google Play for Android. And lastly, tell a friend about us. For my guest, Eugene L. Meyer, I'm Dan Mariaschin. We'll talk to you next time on the B'nai B'rith International Podcast.